Okay, let's get into it. For this deep dive, we are plunging right into the heart of New England. We're going past those, postcard pictures of fall foliage and all the political sound bites you always hear. We want to understand a truly unique and, I think, often misunderstood place, New Hampshire.
That's absolutely right. The Granite State is a fascinating study in American identity, really, because it embodies these just stark contradictions. So our mission today is to distill the core facts, all the surprising nuggets from the sources, and really get to the root of its fiercely independent, almost anti-establishment spirit.
And understand how its geography, which is pretty extreme, dictates not just its history, but its whole modern economy.
Exactly.
So we're setting the stage right away with some of the essentials, because this state is really defined by its nicknames and its motto. Most famously, it's the Granite State, which is a reference to its geology, its quarries, but you also hear the White Mountain State.
And of course, the motto. It's not just some nice phrase on a license plate, it's a defiant declaration. Live free or die.
It really is. The capital's conquered, but Manchester is the largest city, and it's the clear economic hub.
Well, what's genuinely fascinating here is the massive paradox the state represents when you actually look at the data. I mean, on one hand, our sources confirm New Hampshire is structurally one of the most successful states in the entire nation.
Right. For instance, it ties with Massachusetts for the highest Human Development Index, the HDI in the country.
Which is a huge deal.
We should probably unpack that for a moment, because the HDI is a crucial metric. It goes way beyond just GDP. What does tying for the highest HDI actually mean for the average person living there?
So the Human Development Index is a composite statistic, and New Hampshire scores so highly because it measures three fundamental things: a long and healthy life, a high level of knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
Okay.
And New Hampshire just excels in all three. You see low poverty rates, high life expectancy, and a really well-educated population. So that gives it this high overall. You could call it a human flourishing score.
So you have this population that's highly educated, economically successful, and yet culturally and structurally, it's defined by this intense anti-establishment streak.
Absolutely. I mean, it is famous for being the least religious state in the U.S., which reflects a high degree of social nonconformity. And politically, it's defined by this intensely libertarian-leaning culture. It prioritizes small government and low taxes above pretty much everything else.
So it's an affluent, educated, successful cultural island that's also known for just defying centralized authority.
That's the paradox.
That defiance, that radical self-determination, it must have been etched in stone right from the beginning. So let's unpack the revolutionary origins of that famous motto, because the state's earliest actions, they really set the tone for its whole identity.
And that tone starts long before the colonists arrived, of course. For thousands of years before any European settled, this area was inhabited by Algonquian-speaking peoples, predominantly the Abenaki nations.
Right.
Archaeological digs near Keene have indicated an indigenous presence dating back. I mean, it's an astonishing 12,000 years.
12,000 years. That's deep history.
It is. The Abenaki, and that includes groups like the Pennacook and the Cowassuck, they relied on the rivers for fishing and trade, and they had really distinct cultures. And when the English started arriving, the land was obviously occupied, which led to inevitable conflict and eventually the displacement of most of that native population.
The colonial phase then begins in the early 17th century, right?
Yeah.
After the first English and French explorers show up around 1600. The first permanent European settlement was Hilton's Point, which is now Dover.
And the colony itself, the province of New Hampshire, was formally established in 1629. It got its name simply from the English county of Hampshire. By 1679, this area, which had been kind of loosely administered as part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, became its own thing, the Royal Province of New Hampshire.
But the real status of New Hampshire as this radical actor that comes during the lead-up to the American Revolution. The state wasn't just in the revolution. It was actively setting the pace, often doing things first.
Which absolutely solidifies that motto in its founding mythos. To understand the genesis of live free or die, you have to look at one specific, often overlooked event, the raid on Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth. The sources detail this as one of the very earliest acts of armed rebellion back in December 1774.
And this is months before the shots heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. This is the definition of a premature escalation. It set the political temperature for the whole region.
Exactly. Paul Revere, after riding up from Boston, he warned the local patriots, especially the Sons of Liberty, that the British garrison at Fort William and Mary was about to be reinforced. And that fort held a critical store of weapons and gunpowder.
And the local patriots, led by this prominent figure, John Sullivan, they didn't hesitate. They didn't write letters or organize a protest. They launched a direct military action the very next day.
That's right. Sullivan, who would later become a major general in the Continental Army, he got hundreds of men together, they sailed up the Piscataqua River, and they stormed the fort. They overwhelmed the small British garrison and seized just a huge store of gunpowder and arms.
And the British soldiers inside actually fired cannons and muskets at them during the raid.
They did.
And while our sources say no major casualties were recorded, the significance is you just can't overstate it. By physically seizing a British military asset and getting into an armed exchange, historians consider these to be among the first shots fired in the entire American Revolutionary period.
It predated Lexington and Concord by about 5 months.
5 months. That's the critical takeaway, isn't it? New Hampshire showed a willingness to start a military conflict for liberty before any other colony. They were the regional fire starter.
They weren't waiting for the Continental Congress to decide. They decided their path had to be defined by immediate action.
And they weren't done being radical trendsetters. Fast forward just over a year to January 5th, 1776. This is a crucial foundational fact. New Hampshire became the first British North American colony to declare independence from Great Britain.
And they established their own independent government and state constitution.
Think about the strategic risk in that. This wasn't just a vote for a general resolution. They drew up their own constitution and government nearly 6 months before the Continental Congress even signed the Declaration of Independence.
It signaled to the world that New Hampshire was, in its own mind, already a sovereign entity.
That act of constitutional boldness just deeply informs its current political identity, right? They need to go its own way, forge its own rules, never wait for consensus.
And it continued throughout the war. The state supplied a lot of troops, ships, and supplies to the fight. It also provided key figures, most notably Josiah Bartlett. He was a remarkably versatile and dedicated leader.
A founding father who wore a lot of hats. A doctor, a chief justice, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention.
And a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. He was really the embodiment of that industrious, self-reliant ethos of the state. He later served as its first governor.
And tying it all back into the final national framework, New Hampshire played this critical role in bringing the U.S. Constitution into effect. 9 states needed to ratify it for the document to become law, and New Hampshire was the 9th.
That's right, June 21st, 1788. The state ratified the Constitution, providing that final necessary vote. So you see New Hampshire moving from being the fire starter of the Revolution to the finisher of the Constitution. Its early history is just. It's anything but passive.
It's one of constant, aggressive political action. That historical character definitely helps explain why the state maintains such a distinct political path today, especially compared to its more liberal New England neighbors. Now let's move from that revolutionary core to the massive geographic extremes that shaped where people settled, starting with why it's even called the Granite State.
Well, transitioning from history to geology, the nickname is incredibly literal. It refers directly to its extensive, durable granite formations. These rocks have really underpinned its economy and its sense of toughness. For decades, granite quarries, especially around Concord, provided stone for major construction projects all over New England and even nationally.
So it's a state literally built on hard, durable rock. And that geological foundation gives rise to its dramatic terrain, especially the White Mountains range, which defines its physical character. And this area is defined by some of the most dramatic and dangerous climate conditions in the country.
And when you talk about dramatic terrain, you have to talk about Mount Washington. It's the tallest peak in the entire northeastern U.S. at 6,288.3 feet. The summit is famous globally because the Weather Observatory there proudly claims to have the world's worst weather. And, it's not hyperbole. It's basically a real-time laboratory for meteorological extremes.
I mean, worst weather sounds dramatic, but what does the data actually say? Because the sources back this claim up with some astonishing facts that go way beyond just snow and cold.
The data it's truly staggering. Mount Washington averages hurricane-force winds, but winds over 74 miles per hour every third day on average. But the real headline maker is the wind speed record. The peak holds the record for the second highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth.
Which was?
231 miles per hour clocked in April 1934.
231.
Right.
That's less like a mountain peak and more like the surface of a hurricane. It's almost impossible to comprehend the sheer force of that.
And the environment is so brutal that the native plant life has had to adapt in this really unique way just to survive. The trees near the summit are these dwarf, matted forms known as krummholz.
What exactly is Krummholz? It sounds like botanical jargon.
It translates roughly from German as crooked wood, and they aren't genetically distinct dwarf trees. They're regular species like spruce and fir that have been physically sculpted by the weather. The fierce winds and ice just blast away any new growth above the snowline, forcing the trees to grow horizontally.
Creating these dense, tangled, low-lying mats like a carpet of bonsai trees.
Exactly, clinging tightly to the rock just to withstand those incredible conditions.
The mountain's ruggedness also comes with a pretty grim statistic. Over 100 recorded deaths among visitors. It just reflects the speed and ferocity with which that weather can turn deadly.
It's a powerful and formidable peak. And just southwest of the White Mountains, you find the Monadnock region and Mount Monadnock. This landmark is famous not for its height, but for its accessibility and distinct formation. It's consistently cited as among the most climbed mountains in the world.
How many people are we talking about?
Some estimates put the number of annual visitors near 125,000.
Wow. That sheer volume of climbers really speaks to its iconic status. And geologically, it's so distinct that it gave its name to an entire class of earth forms.
Yes, in geomorphology, a monadnock is defined as any isolated, resistant peak rising dramatically from a less resistant, eroded plain. Monadnock literally means mountain that stands alone in the Abenaki language, which perfectly describes it.
Now, moving from the mountain heights down to the coast, New Hampshire holds a different kind of extreme record. It has the shortest ocean coastline of any U.S. coastal state. Depending on how you measure, it's about 18 miles or sometimes just 13 miles long.
And you contrast that tiny stretch with the immense coastlines of Maine or Massachusetts. That short coast is heavily used, though. It supports the port of Portsmouth and popular summer spots like Hampton Beach, which is a bustling commercial center in the summer.
And about 7 miles offshore are the Isles of Shoals, a cluster of 9 small islands. 4 of them are technically in New Hampshire.
And they have a colorful history. They were key fishing grounds, but in the 19th century, they became famous as the site of an influential art colony founded by the poet Celia Thaxter. And for the more adventurous, the islands are famous for being the alleged location of one of Blackbeard's buried treasures.
Spurring treasure hunts for generations. Now, if the eastern border is short and tidy, the western border is uniquely complicated. The state line with Vermont runs along the 410-mile-long Connecticut River. But here's the kicker. The state line isn't in the middle of the river, which is usually the case.
No, it is not. This goes back to colonial charters, and the definition has been legally upheld. The border is legally defined at the low water mark on the Vermont side. This means that almost the entire river along that 410-mile stretch lies legally within New Hampshire's jurisdiction.
That is a huge geographical and political anomaly. It effectively grants New Hampshire jurisdiction over a massive body of water. What are the practical implications of that?
It's huge. It determines everything from fishing regulations and water rights to law enforcement. If a crime occurs on the water, New Hampshire has the authority. It's a centuries-old claim that gives New Hampshire this undeniable edge in natural resource control.
And looking at the wider environment, New Hampshire is just dominated by forests. It boasts the highest percentage of timberland area of any state in the country. Something like 84% of the state is forested.
And this massive forest canopy, especially the brilliant deciduous trees, creates the perfect conditions for one of the state's biggest tourism draws, the famous leaf peepers, who flock there every autumn for the fall foliage. It's an enormous economic driver.
However, this gorgeous, rugged geography presents some significant economic challenges in the age of climate change. As we noted, New Hampshire has some of the highest ski mountains on the East Coast, supporting a major winter sports sector.
This is a looming crisis for specific communities. Our sources project a significant decline in winter season lengths at ski areas across New Hampshire due to climate change. This is already contributing to the historic contraction of the ski industry, threatening the smaller operations and the communities that really rely on that winter revenue.
So we're not talking hypotheticals. We're talking about direct economic stress on towns near mountains like Cannon and Attitash. The identity of many of these places is tied to the reliability of snow. A shorter winter means a massive cut in their primary economic activity.
It creates a stark tension, you know? The same beautiful, rugged landscape that defines New Hampshire's appeal is also the source of its growing economic vulnerability.
That paints a really compelling picture of a land shaped by extremes. Let's move on now to how the population adapted, diving into the state's economic evolution and demographic shifts, which, again, reveal these incredible contrasts.
New Hampshire's economy underwent this foundational, often painful transformation during the 20th century. Historically, in the mid-19th century, the economic base was centered on traditional New England industries. Massive textile manufacturing, shoemaking, papermaking.
The sheer scale of that industrial boom was globally recognized. We're talking specifically about the Ameskeed Manufacturing Company in Manchester, which, according to our sources, was once the largest cotton textile plant in the world.
Ameskeed was essentially a self-contained industrial city. At its peak, it employed over 17,000 workers and controlled vast tracts of land, housing, infrastructure in Manchester. This factory town model created immense wealth and attracted a huge influx of immigrant labor, especially from Quebec, to fuel the mills.
But the sources confirm that these traditional sectors saw a sharp, dramatic decline after World War II. It was a rapid structural collapse.
Yeah, it was hastened by several factors. Obsolete plants couldn't compete, there was fierce competition from cheaper wages in the South, and decades of labor unrest. Ameskeed itself filed for bankruptcy in 1935, and while parts of it limped along, the massive textile era was over by the mid-20th century.
So the state had to reinvent itself.
Yeah.
And the modern economy is much more varied. That reinvention has been pretty successful, which links back to that high human development index we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The state successfully diversified into financial services, real estate, education, transportation, and high tech. And while the massive mills are gone, manufacturing output today, producing things like specialized machinery, electric equipment, medical devices, it still remains higher than the U.S. average. This is higher value manufacturing.
And this shift in economic gravity, coupled with the decline of the North Country industries, triggered a dramatic demographic shift, a massive population migration southward.
The statistics are clear. The state center of population has moved a full 12 miles south just since 1950. That migration directly reflects the rapid growth along the Massachusetts border, where communities have become economically integrated with Greater Boston, basically functioning as commuter towns.
So the population concentration is stark. The 4 southern counties account for a massive 72% of the entire state's population. Hillsborough County alone has nearly 30% of the population.
Right, and this creates a kind of two-tiered economy within the state. You contrast the affluent growing south with the North Country, the northern third of the state. It's very sparsely populated. Coos County, for example, covers a fourth of the state but has less than 5% of the population.
And while the South benefits from Boston's economic engine, the North Country is suffering from economic isolation, still struggling to recover from the decline of logging and paper industries. The only thing really keeping the economy afloat up there is tourism.
And speaking of demographics, let's revisit that industrial legacy, the French connection. That boom caused a massive, sustained influx of French Canadians and Acadians seeking work in the mills.
The resulting cultural influence is profound and persistent. Today, New Hampshire has the highest percentage, 22.9% of residents with French, Canadian, or Acadian ancestry of any U.S. state, nearly 1 in 4 residents.
And the language ties remain strong. In Coos County, particularly, nearly 10% of the population speaks French at home, reflecting that close proximity to Quebec. It's so culturally embedded that French is officially allowed for business with Quebec.
Okay, now we have to turn to the famous tax paradox. This is the heart of the live free or die economic philosophy. New Hampshire is incredibly unique because it's one of only 9 states without a broad-based general income tax.
And that's just the start. There's also no general sales tax, no capital gains tax, and no inheritance tax. It's an intentionally light state tax burden by design, reflecting that long-standing disdain for state taxation and bureaucracy.
But this raises the critical question that defines the state's political conflicts. If the state isn't relying on these broad taxes, how does it fund its operations and, crucially, public education?
And the answer is the sharp point of the tax paradox. Since the state refuses to rely on income or sales taxes, it delegates the immense burden of funding essential services, primarily schools, almost entirely to local property taxes.
So instead of the burden being spread out through income or consumption taxes across the whole population, it's concentrated heavily onto property owners at the local level.
Exactly. And the consequence is that New Hampshire has property tax rates that are shockingly high. Our sources note they're the 8th highest in the entire U.S. That's the financial cost of live free or die. You might escape state income tax, but you pay a premium on your home.
but that's the essential counterbalance you have to consider. Despite that crushing local property tax burden, when you combine all state and local tax collections together, New Hampshire's overall combined tax burden is still ranked among the lowest in the country.
Right. It creates a system that heavily rewards high-income, high-spending people who don't necessarily own expensive property, while potentially penalizing property owners, especially those on fixed incomes. It's a very specific arrangement that privileges a certain kind of fiscal liberty.
One final detail on the economy. Energy. New Hampshire has low overall energy consumption, but the way they heat their homes is unique, with nearly half of households using fuel oil for winter heating, one of the largest shares in the U.S.
But the generation of power is hugely centralized and non-carbon intensive. The Seabrook Station nuclear power plant is critically important. It's the largest individual electrical generating unit on the entire New England power grid and provides something like 57% of New Hampshire's electricity. This reliance on nuclear makes its power profile very different.
So we have a state of high-tech manufacturing, nuclear power, and radically local tax control. Let's shift now to how this independence translates into governance. Section 4. Politics, liberty, and the first primary.
As we've established, the political culture is defined by that powerful libertarian-leaning that encourages intense fiscal conservatism, prioritizing that anti-tax stance, while often fostering cultural liberalism and social independence. This environment is conducive to nonconformity, shown by its status as the least religious state in the Union.
Right. A 2016 Gallup poll found only 20% considered themselves very religious, and more recent data shows over 40% are religiously unaffiliated.
And this political philosophy is structurally embedded in its actual government, starting with a powerful disdain for state bureaucracy. This is perfectly exemplified by the structure of the state legislature, the General Court.
The structure is a true anomaly. The House of Representatives has an astounding 400 members. That number makes it one of the largest elected bodies in the entire English-speaking world.
Right, second only to the British Parliament's House of Commons.
400 representatives serving a population of only 1.4 million people. That means each representative serves only about 500 constituents. But what makes this system truly unique is how they're compensated.
They've fully embraced the volunteer ethic. Legislators are paid a nominal salary of only $200 per two-year term, plus travel. It's by far the lowest legislative pay in the U.S. It is not designed to be a career. It's designed to be a civic duty.
$200 for 2 years of service. That's a legislative body run entirely by volunteers, who realistically has the financial freedom to do that.
That's the critical sociological consequence. Our sources note that nearly half of them are retirees, but the rest are generally people who are financially independent, wealthy, or have jobs with extreme flexibility. It inevitably shapes the demographics of who's in power.
So while the system is designed to prevent a paid professional political class from forming, the consequence is the creation of an entrenched, non-compensated political class from a pretty narrow socioeconomic band.
It's a fascinating paradox of small government ideals. And beyond the legislature, the executive branch is also unusual. It's bifurcated. It's not solely run by the governor.
How does that work in practice?
The governor has to share power with a separate, powerful 5-member executive council. This council has immense power. It holds veto power over major state contracts, and it must advise and consent to the governor's nominations for all major state positions, including judgeships.
That is a huge check on the governor's power. It reflects that deep-seated historical fear of executive overreach.
Yes, it's a systematic diffusion of authority. Also unusual. New Hampshire is one of the few states that doesn't have a lieutenant governor. If the governor can't perform their duties, the Senate president steps in.
And this decentralization extends powerfully to local governance. New Hampshire is technically a Dillon Rule state. Can you explain what that is and why it matters here?
The Dillon Rule is a legal principle that says municipal governments only have the powers expressly granted to them by the state. The state keeps all unstated powers. However, despite being a Dillon Rule state, the New Hampshire legislature has historically chosen to strongly favor local control, especially with land use and schools.
So the state could impose massive centralization, but philosophically it chooses not to.
Exactly. This is why most towns still operate on the town meeting form of government, where the voters themselves physically meet, debate, and vote on the town budget. It's direct democracy in action.
This extreme focus on local independence is why the state is so fiercely protective of its national political role, which brings us to the New Hampshire primary.
The New Hampshire primary is, without a doubt, the state's largest cultural and political export. It is the critical first primary in the American presidential election cycle, granting the state this outsized influence.
And its status isn't just tradition. It's aggressively protected by law. State statute explicitly mandates that the Secretary of State must schedule the election at least 1 week before any similar event.
And while the Iowa caucus comes before it, Iowa uses a complicated process. The New Hampshire primary is the nation's first contest that uses the same standardized secret ballot as the general election, which gives the results immediate legitimacy and draws massive media attention.
And that leads to those quirky traditions like the famous midnight voting.
It's a classic of New Hampshire politics. State law lets towns with fewer than 100 residents, like Dixville Notch, open their polls at midnight and close as soon as everyone has voted. This allows them to be the first precincts in the entire country to report results.
That primary status is fiercely guarded, as we saw just recently. The sources detail the 2023 political conflict where the Democratic National Committee tried to shift the primary calendar and put South Carolina first.
And New Hampshire officials from both parties stood united. They explicitly stood by their state's first-in-the-nation law and basically ignored the DNC's directive. They argued that their state law takes precedence over the national party's schedule.
That's that revolutionary independence shining through again, even against their own national party. They just refuse to relinquish their power.
And that independent, libertarian spirit has attracted a specific political migration aimed at amplifying these ideals. The Free State Project, or FSP, founded in 2001, its explicit goal is to recruit 20,000 libertarians to move to the state to concentrate their political activism.
This is intentional, long-term demographic engineering. Why New Hampshire specifically?
Because of the structural features we just discussed. The massive volunteer legislature means a concentrated group of motivated activists can gain maximum influence for minimum financial cost. By moving thousands of participants to a state of 1.4 million, they have successfully elected FSP members into the House of Representatives.
It's a unique way to shape the political landscape. Wrapping up the election history, New Hampshire has proven to be the ultimate swing state. It's supported Democrats in almost every presidential election since 1992, but it was also the only state to switch from supporting Bush in 2000 to Kerry in 2004.
And this independent streak results in this intense paradox in its current representation. As of 2025, Republicans control the state-level trifecta, the governorship, the executive council, and the legislature.
But at the same time, Democrats control the entire federal delegation, both U.S. senators and both representatives. It shows that voters are willing to split their tickets completely based on the office and the candidate.
We should also highlight a remarkable footnote. In 2012, New Hampshire became the first state in U.S. history to elect an all-female federal delegation.
That sets us up nicely to finish our deep dive by looking at some of the less formal aspects of the state: infrastructure, education, and culture, where you see more of these conflicts between tradition and modernization. Let's start with Section 5.
On the transportation side, New Hampshire is generally easy to navigate thanks to a well-maintained interstate network. I-93 is the main route connecting the dense south to the more remote White Mountains.
And I love this small cultural detail about the highway system. State highway markers still proudly depict the old man of the mountain.
Even though the rock formation itself, that famous face-like profile in Franconia Notch, collapsed back in May 2003.
Yet the symbol remains on government emblems, highway signs, license plates. It's a deliberate choice to maintain that connection to the state's rugged heritage, despite the physical loss.
Regarding rail, there's a clear push to integrate the state more closely with Boston. There's an ongoing goal to extend the MBTA commuter rail into New Hampshire, specifically to Nashua, Concord, and Manchester.
But that project is currently stalled, right? Largely due to political resistance over the cost and the philosophical opposition to state-funded projects that might raise taxes.
It's another tension point between economic necessity and political ideology. For tourists, though, lines like the famous Mount Washington Cog Railway remain a huge attraction.
Turning to education, New Hampshire punches well above its weight. It's home to several incredibly prestigious prep schools, like Phillips Exeter Academy and St. Paul's School.
And its higher education landscape is also strong, featuring Dartmouth College, an Ivy League institution, the University of New Hampshire, and Seton New Hampshire University, which is one of the fastest-growing universities in the nation, especially in the online space.
But again, that independent spirit and the philosophy of local funding run head-on into the issue of school funding, leading to a massive, decades-long legal battle known as the Claremont litigation, which started way back in 1993.
This is a perfect microcosm of New Hampshire's structural conflicts. The core issue stemmed directly from that reliance on local property taxes. Since school funding was handled almost entirely locally, property-poor districts just couldn't generate the same revenue as wealthy suburbs.
So the quality of your child's education was directly tied to the value of your neighbors' homes. That's the definition of inequity.
Absolutely. The New Hampshire Supreme Court ultimately made a landmark ruling. They said the state constitution required the state to fund education adequately and uniformly across all districts. This ruling demanded the state take on a massive financial responsibility to bridge that gap.
Which essentially challenged the entire local control tax philosophy. If the state is constitutionally responsible for funding, it can't just delegate the whole burden to towns.
Precisely. To address this, the legislature enacted a statewide property tax in 2002 to collect revenue and redistribute funds. But the system was riddled with loopholes and political fights, and it failed to fully solve the underlying issue.
And the legal battle continued, culminating in 2023 when a judge set a new, higher amount for what constitutes that constitutional adequacy, arguing the state still hadn't fulfilled its mandate.
This just illustrates that the tension between local financial control and the state's constitutional mandate to provide uniform education is an expensive, ongoing fight that refuses to die.
It's a perfect circle.
Right.
Radical local freedom combined with persistent structural conflict over who ultimately pays for the fundamentals.
Let's end on a lighter note with some unique cultural nuggets, starting with a quirky invention.
We're talking about paintball. It was invented in Henniker in 1981 by a group of friends who originally intended it as a way to mark trees or cattle. They quickly realized it was an excellent competitive sport.
And Sutton, New Hampshire was home to the world's first commercial paintball facility. A true New Hampshire original that took an industrial tool and turned it into a global pastime.
And for classic entertainment, FunSpot in Laconia is a major institution. It's recognized by Guinness World Records as the world's largest video arcade, though it's now more like an impressive museum.
New Hampshire has also lent itself well to fiction. The fictional town of Grover's Corners in Thornton Wilder's classic play Our Town is based partly on the real town of Peterborough. Wilder spent time there at the McDowell Colony.
And its famous motto and remote geography have made their way into modern TV, usually as a place of escape or isolation. Breaking Bad had a famous episode titled Granite State, where the lead character flees to a remote cabin there.
And an episode of The Sopranos was titled Live Free or Die, reflecting a character fleeing to New Hampshire, leveraging the state's reputation for rugged independence.
Finally, in sports, the state is a major hub for motorsports, home to the New Hampshire Motor Speedway in Loudon, which hosts NASCAR and IndyCar. And you can't forget the collegiate scene, anchored by Dartmouth and the University of New Hampshire.
It's a complete and complex picture, isn't it? From its granite peaks and world record weather to its deep French-Canadian roots and its fiercely contested political structure. It's a land of contrasts.
This deep dive really reveals New Hampshire as a state defined by this intense duality. On one hand, you have the rugged, dramatic geography of the White Mountains and a history of radical, first rebel political action, the Granite State. On the other, you have the modern identity centered on the low-tax, fiercely independent philosophy of live free or die.
And what's essential to grasp is how that low-tax philosophy plays out structurally in real life. The state prizes individual liberty and local control, achieving one of the lowest overall tax burdens in the country, but that freedom comes at a specific, localized cost.
That cost is twofold. A deep reliance on the immense, uncompensated work of volunteer, extremely low-paid legislators running one of the largest legislative bodies in the world.
And the absolute necessity of imposing the U.S.'s 8th highest property taxes at the local level to fund essentials like education, which, as the Claremont litigation shows, leads to decades of structural conflict and questions of equity.
It's a powerful model of decentralized governance, yet one that places an incredible burden on local communities and unpaid volunteers. The whole system relies on the premise that citizens will be engaged, affluent, and dedicated enough to run the government without being paid.
Exactly.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Given New Hampshire's powerful tradition of radical independence, its high level of education, and its fierce adherence to that first-in-the-nation primary status, what does its extreme decentralized structure, from its volunteer legislature to its reliance on local control for school funding, reveal about the true cost and function of small government libertarian ideals in practice? Is this model sustainable? And does the high cost borne by local property owners and volunteer legislators ultimately undermine the intended liberty of the live free or die experiment? In an ongoing, real-world case study right there in New England.